I always wanted to get the Purple Heart.
Eyes left.
Those weapons of mass destruction got to be somewhere.
By 2014, the war in Afghanistan will be over.
Eyes left.
Well, a general is not necessarily a general.
No weapons over there.
He may be a communist. Eyes left.
Hey everybody, it is Eyes Left. I'm your host, Mike Preisner.
And I'm your host, Spencer Rapone.
Welcome back, y'all. Know it's been a long time. Been busy with different things. Both of us have been out in the streets quite a bit too. Spencer, you were just at some demonstrations recently.
Yeah, I was at the International Women's Strike Action in Union Square here in New York City. Pretty good turnout. Some great speakers. As always, a few different reactionary, right-wing, alt-right types trying to, disrupt things. But myself and the New York City DSA Marshal team, otherwise known as the Red Rabbits, had some good work done collectively to prevent anyone from getting hurt or getting harassed. And it was, the event went off pretty much without a hitch. Everyone was safe, and it was a pretty a proud day, I think, for all involved.
Yeah, that's an interesting development, Spencer, because, here in LA, there is these nationwide actions against U.S. Sanctions and coup and potential war in Venezuela. There's a National Day of Action that happened in D.C. where there is thousands of people came out for it. I mean, buses went from all across the country. It was one of the biggest anti-war marches that has happened since the Iraq War era. Here in Los Angeles, we had about 500 people in LA that came out for it also and marched to City Hall. So really incredible turnouts. Really was encouraging to see so many people wanting to take action against this, just the sanctions in general, but the possible war, of course. But like you experienced, there's some right-wing Venezuelans came, like pro-coup Venezuelans, like about 5 of them, but they were joined by about 5 like MAGA Proud Boy guys who had like their shirts off and were just there chanting like socialism sucks and just trying to provoke a fight. I mean, they have these white guys didn't care about Venezuela in any way, but they came to fight socialists, to beat up socialists. That was the explicit reason they were there. And so I know you dealt with some that security concern as well, which is really kind of a new thing in a lot of ways. I mean, I'm used to counter protesters coming to demonstrations, but these like actual like fascist like guys who are trying to earn their next rank in the Proud Boys or whatever by like beating someone up, and it's like, it's scary too, because you don't know, do they have a knife? Are they going to shoot someone? Yeah. It's like kind of a different phase that we're in now of political violence that I'm definitely not used to, but something that as you experienced this past week, you got to take seriously in your security concerns as an organization.
Yeah, I mean, the most prominent figure that was present at the action in New York City, his name's Jovi Val, and he's kind of like a recurring alt-right troll that shows up. And, he's the kind of guy that, I mean, like most of these people are, they'll talk a big game, they'll act like, like they're this big guy who will bully you. But when you actually get in their face and call them out, they tend to back down a lot. So this guy, he kept trying to walk around the perimeter of the action, and myself and some others just like had enough and just confronted him head on. We weren't escalatory, we were very calm, but we just kind of like stayed in his face, didn't give him an inch, refuted every bullshit thing he was trying to peddle there. One of the most, I guess, striking moments was when he brought out a Confederate flag and started doing the whole bullshit. It's about heritage, and what doesn't even make sense because there's nothing that suggests that he's from the South or anyone there really. I mean, so right. It's obviously a symbol of white supremacy. So I said that to him. Then he started saying some insane shit about how women were more free in the South or something, like some really bizarre, like Frankenstein version of Gone with the Wind or something. And so I just, that's like one of my berserk buttons. So I just went on my whole tirade about, the Civil War being, obviously about, slavery, how internationally it was seen as that, and many of the prominent thinkers of the time were invested in its outcome, and how, anything to paint it as otherwise. The whole states' right thing is nonsense. And even if you want to say that, well, yeah, it was their states' rights to, enslave other human beings. So, just kind of gave him like a historical analysis while I was following him around. So it was actually kind of entertaining on some level. But yeah, he was pretty demoralized by the end because of our collective efforts. So yeah, that was, it's a good example of, if you know your shit and you're not afraid to challenge someone, and if it's within your capacity, that's another tactic, is just kind of like tire these people out, with, arming yourself with the truth and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and it's in these situations also, of course the police are always at these actions.
Yeah.
But and so a lot of people I think default to the police and say, well, if these people are going to do anything crazy, if they're going to try to instigate any violence and things like that, the police are going to take care of it. But we know that is not true. I mean, on the one hand, of course, the police, they really see themselves as like against leftists in a way, that these are the flag burners that want to destroy America, and they're like the soldiers that are standing protecting our country, protecting our flag from being burned and things like that. Right. So they actually identify with the right-wing counter-protesters that come.
Of course.
The uber-patriotic, hyper-nationalist guys. But to a degree, we've even seen, there's some recent revelation, I think, from the Portland anti-fascist organizing, but this has come out in Southern California, on the East Coast, all over, where it's proven that the police not only kind of ideologically sympathize with the right-wingers that are coming out to counter-protest, whether it be an immigrant rights demonstration, a women's rights like you were at, but they actually have been coordinating with them. And in a communication, not in a way that's like their counterintelligence like operation on behalf of the police, but collaborating with them and how they're going to police the demonstrations, and allowing the fascists, allowing the right-wingers to do things that the progressive side of the protest would never be allowed to do, like busting in the demonstrations, hitting people, all types of stuff. And so they like use them in a way as a, kind of a brown shirt type auxiliary of the police forces when it comes to these things. And so that's why it's important that, like, like you said, you're in like a security contingent. I mean, we have to be as organized as the police are in this respect, because the police obviously are on the other side.
Yeah, no, I mean, at the end of the day, I think everything you said is spot on. I mean, the other thing I'll add is that, you'll be in certain situations where, for example, this Jovi character, when he busted out the Confederate flag, he was trying to instigate someone into fighting him. And if that person would have taken the bait, then from the cops' perspective, it would look like the person who took the bait was the aggressor, and they would have been the ones getting tackled, probably arrested, and so on. Yep. While this, fucking troll would have just kind of walked away pretty much unscathed. So, it's always, important to keep your head on a swivel and make sure that, you're not only protecting, your comrades that are there with you, but, other people who might be walking by, like this one person who started to challenge Jovi that wasn't even, part of the action, but he just, he had a moral compass, saw someone brandishing a symbol of white supremacy and thought to challenge him. And so, we had to make sure that we were backing this person up so that they wouldn't be apprehended by the police. So.
Yeah. And, I think these right-wingers, whether it's the MAGA hat wearing people, the more explicit white nationalist people, the ones that kind of try to couch it in like, oh, I'm just trolling and whatever, that's kind of their defense, right? Is that they're not actually neo-Nazis. They're not actually, trying to hurt anyone, that they're just trolling. They're just trolling. We've seen with this horrific massacre in New Zealand by this white nationalist, he was doing all these same things that are just trolly things, right? The OK sign, which that's like white supremacist gang sign that all the MAGA and Proud Boy types do. And they say, it's just the OK sign. It's not a white nationalist symbol. It's just the OK sign. And it's their way of trolling. He was doing that in court. He started the massacre by using this slogan, subscribe to PewDiePie, which is this new white nationalist slogan that was, of course, scrawled on a Holocaust memorial before, but it's this slogan that they use to say they have this deniability. It doesn't mean anything bad. It just means we like this guy's YouTube channel. This guy's manifesto, this guy that murdered all of these people, it had throughout it all of these 4chan, Reddit, like trolley type references. So it's like this is the new neo-Nazi movement. Right. And they use all these symbols and things to deny that it's actually open. They're not doing a Hitler salute. They don't have a Nazi banner on, but they have Pepe the Frog. They have other things. And they deny that that's what it is, But in reality, this is what is being taken up by more than one mass murderer now. But in particular, this guy in New Zealand who carried out such a horrific, devastating killing.
I mean, one of the most horrifying aspects and what's so baffling about it is everything you said, and this guy's mind, this horrible atrocity, this mass murder he's carrying out, he's doing like an epic meme. I mean, this for him is part of the culture that he's been embroiled in for the past how many years? At least 2, because he said that he's been planning this attack for 2. Mm-hmm. And it shows you like just how reactive a lot of these different currents are, especially on 4chan where a lot of this originates. I mean, but the fact, like you said, he invokes PewDiePie, even the music he was playing in the horrifying video.
Oh, wow.
Had to do with like different online memes and so on. He mentions there's this meme that refers to the genocide of Bosnian Muslims that happened in the course of the Yugoslav Civil War, and this phrase referring to Muslims by a racist epithet, kebab, and he was using that in his manifesto, and then I guess the most important thing to comment on, and I really wanted to get this out here, is that, again, in the manifesto, he denies that he's a Nazi. And unlike a lot of alt-right, though, he does refer to himself as an eco-fascist. And, we've talked about fascism on this show before, and I've recommended Umberto Eco's Fascism, in particular because I think it does the best in capturing how a lot of these currents of fascist thought, of alt-right ideology, they're not ever going to be anything coherent necessarily. When you read this guy's manifesto, I mean, he's very clear what he wants to do. He's very clearly racist. He's very clearly a white supremacist, and he very clearly has murderous ideations. But he also tries to muddy the waters at certain junctions. He invokes anti-imperialism a couple times, but that's all it is. It's merely an invocation. There's not a semblance of anti-imperialism in the manifesto, but he uses this term to enact a sort of confusion. And when you look through it, you see, like most fascist currents, at its core, it is fundamentally a politics of exclusion. And that's one of the key tenets of fascism and white supremacist thought. So I've seen a couple different commentators on this say something to the effect of, unless you really study this stuff coherently, or you have some type of scholarly investment, or you're really familiar with this, don't read it because it's like, dangerous. And I understand the impulse, because obviously you don't want to give this guy any more of a platform. But I disagree in giving this killer too much credit. I mean, because at the end of the day, his manifesto is just kind of the ramblings of an online alt-right dipshit who was particularly more invested than others and actually took a lot of these ideas and these memes and these phrases and so on and so forth to their logical conclusion. I mean, he even includes the infamous Navy SEAL copy pasta in his manifesto. I mean, it's just absolutely grim. And it's like seeing the bill come due for all of these horrifying memes that have been, gaining currency for the past 5 years, and how they have just, incubated all of this hate and all of this, white supremacist ideology. But at the end of the day, this guy is a fascist. He's a white supremacist, and he doesn't have any great insight in his manifesto. It's just a contemporary version of someone using the cultural signifiers and the different memes that are popular right now in order to bolster his own hateful, anti-immigrant, ethno-nationalist, fascist message.
Yeah, and and he's coming from this community that we're seeing is very dominant now and very vocal. The ones that are like the free speech defenders and like right-wingers like Ben Shapiro. I mean, they're from this very community, and he's not the only one that has been killing people, right? I mean, in fact, we're lucky that there aren't more people dead as a result of this era we're in. The guy that killed Heather Hare, I mean, he plowed into a crowd. It was very amazing that only one person died in that attack. You got those two brothers that had worked for Jack Posobiec, also a guy who was in the Navy for a while, that they got, they weren't able to carry out an attack that they were planning. There's all these like possible things that could have happened if it weren't for them backing out or whatever. But it's like this community is carrying out horrible acts of violence. I mean, it's MAGA people. And in fact, it was interesting to see that while that guy, this New Zealand murderer, was doing this okay sign in court, the like same day there's this other guy who killed this like mob boss in New York or something. He flashes in court written on his hand, MAGA forever and QAnon. QAnon being this other kind of fringe like MAGA sector who believes Trump
conspiracy
is going to
nonsense.
that Trump's going to take down some like child pedophile ring in the government or something like that. So it's really amazing. I mean, imagine if someone had killed a bunch of white people and then in court they had Ilhan Omar forever written on their hand. I mean, I think there would be kind of this like outpouring of condemnation of her, making her denounce all these things. But the fact that these people can be open Trump supporters and saying that, this New Zealand shooter said that Trump is his spiritual leader or whatever. I mean, and it's almost like not even a headline. It's barely in the news story at all that Trump and the triumph of Trump and MAGA-ism or whatever is actually inspiring hate crimes. I mean, hate crimes are up like 50%. White nationalist killings and white nationalist hate crimes and potential hate crimes are surging right now. It's kind of a new reality we're in that seems to be kind of ignored. Yeah, I mean, it's important to note too, as you were kind of getting at, that a lot of these, moments of white supremacist violence have been going on now, even before Trump came to the forefront of American politics. Obviously, a lot of it was emboldened by his run for presidency. And that's why I've always, and myself and others have insisted on the fact that what Trump, represents and what I guess his purpose is, it's not necessarily that he himself is the clear fascist so much as he and his presence and his political project and those around him have unleashed the forces of a sort of neo-fascism. And that's obviously horrifying. And it's important to be able to recognize these different currents of fascist thought where they're present. And this, again, probably the most heinous of them. But, if you've been paying attention, it's not so surprising. If you understand what, at their core, a lot of these different memes or a lot of these different internet subcultures are interested in doing, well, this, again, is just taking these ideas to their logical conclusion. That's right. And, it's this guy, the New Zealand shooter. And I will say that I really think New Zealand takes the right approach with this because the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who I think is a young woman, the youngest head of state in the world, they said that they're not going to let this guy's face be shown and they're not going to let his name be out there. Yeah. So no one knows who, we don't know who this guy is. We don't know what his face looks like, which I think is a really great tactic considering that, like you said, it was just like a one big meme that he was carrying out. They want the publicity. They want that to be memorialized in this way. So I appreciate that the New Zealand has decided that they're going to completely block him out from getting any publicity. But he said his number one person that he's listening to online is Ben Shapiro. Yeah. And I think it was just last year that this guy in Quebec who committed a massacre at a mosque as well, his top person that he visited online was Ben Shapiro. And of course, Ben Shapiro gets interviews in The Economist and the New York Times. He's on Fox News. He's like the keynote speaker at these massive conferences where he probably gets paid $50,000 or something. I mean, he's in the mainstream. He's not like a fringe neo-Nazi YouTuber. He's someone that gets recognized by the establishment press, by mainstream conservative politics. And he's actually inspiring people to carry out like the worst massacres against Muslims. And of course, again, like there's that deniability, just like the okay sign. Oh, we can deny that's what it really is. But Ben Shapiro's entire message is that it's a myth that there's moderate Muslims. Right. That everyone who is a Muslim, if you believe in the Quran, then you believe that we should kill anyone who is not a Muslim. And so his entire explanation of Muslims in the world is that there are no moderate Muslims, that everyone who is a Muslim wants to murder you, wants to murder your family, wants to take over governments and impose Sharia law. So he feeds into this like ridiculous fear-mongering that everyone in a hijab, everyone with a beard, anyone who you can perceive to be Muslim, they want to cut your head off. And so, of course, if you're pumping that into your brain to justify your racism, whatever, that creates that sense of urgency that like, oh yeah, you know what? It is right to go into a mosque and kill a bunch of Muslims because all of them we're fighting a war. And if we don't stop them now, they're going to, come out of this mosque and they're going to take over the town and cut everyone's heads off. It's unbelievable. And it's unbelievable that he's able to escape responsibility. And Trump also. I mean, they all love Trump as well. But Shapiro is actually giving the ideological justification for people to be carrying out these attacks. Yeah,
I mean, part of Shapiro's rise to prominence was the fact that he employed like unbelievably hateful Islamophobic rhetoric and a lot of his, stupid ass, talks and YouTube videos. And I mean, it really fed into this xenophobia. I mean, and let's just say outright that Islamophobia is absolutely racist to its core. I mean, it's predicated on fundamentally anti-Arab, but I mean, even just Islamic peoples writ large, brown person in general. So, I mean, it's just so unbelievably frustrating to see figures like Shapiro and any of these other, alt-right jokers just completely escape any sense of responsibility for the very, very real role they have played in giving a platform to these hateful beliefs. And one word on just the complete lack of understanding of Islam in these circles, but really it's quite prevalent in places like the United States and the UK and France, because many of these, Western nation states, I mean, Islam, much like racism, isn't just someone having a personal belief. It's a systemic structural issue. The same can be said about Islamophobia. And so there's no knowledge of the fact that within Islam, there's something known as Islamic jurisprudence in Arabic, fiqh, which is a human understanding of the Sharia. And there are many rich debates being had about these different understandings, about the different interpretations. Not to mention, interpretation itself, ijtihad, is its own subset of this discourse. So anyone who has a modicum of knowledge of Islam knows that what these people are saying are completely incorrect, in an academic sense, in an ethical sense, in a moral sense, and yet they continually have a platform to peddle this absolute nonsense. And it just drives me insane because, full disclosure, I'm a graduate student. I'm studying the history of the Middle East. I've, taken courses in the past on both history of the Middle East and Islam. So I've had the privilege of having excellent professors teach this to me. But you don't need to be in an academic setting to just fucking Google a few of these things to realize that the likes of Shapiro, Charlie Kirk, Candace Owens, Jordan Peterson, any of these ghouls are completely fucking wrong. And it's just unbelievably frustrating seeing them paint an entire religion, an entire group of people as something that is not reflective of reality whatsoever.
No, you're absolutely right. And as we've mentioned, we've said this before, that any terrorism that impacts Americans or U.S. soil or U.S. service members abroad, terrorism is not caused by Muslim ideology. It's not caused by the Quran. It's caused by U.S. foreign policy. And that way too, I mean, in my experience, coming back from the Iraq War, getting involved in the anti-war movement, I wasn't sure how it was going to be received by a lot of people having been to Iraq, in particular by Iraqis, by people of Arab descent, by Muslims. But I will tell you that it was the Muslim community and Muslim individuals that were like the most welcoming to me, the most kind of like understanding and supportive of my transition from being in the military and to being an anti-war activist. It was the Muslim community that embraced me more than any other and sent me messages of support and things like that. And so anyone who's had any real contact with the Muslim community, be it a religious community, secular Muslims, it's like, that's the experience That's the experience you actually get. And, and Trump's not only just like inspiring people to like carry out these horrible attacks. I mean, he actually like retweeted a guy the other day that said that the New Zealand thing was just like not a false flag, but it was just a way to take away gun rights in New Zealand, like that it was like orchestrated in some way by the anti-gun lobby in New Zealand. So it's really mind-blowing to see that not only is Trump inspiring these people, but he's like backing up the most insane voices that are just going to feed into more of it. But like you're saying, like Ben Shapiro, Candace Owens, of course, another favorite of this shooter in New Zealand. Of course, they're able to exploit all of these anti-Muslim feelings and give it this kind of fake intellectual ideological cover for racism. But of course, they have a big base to do that in because just the post 9/11 era itself just created that. I mean, as soon as there was always this anti-Muslim, anti-Arab racism in the United States, like movies from the 80s and 90s, it's always a Muslim terrorist who's the bad guy in all of these movies. But it went into hyperdrive after 9/11 and in such a different way because they need that racism to justify going and killing and occupying and Muslims and Arab people around the world. They need to like pump that racism into your head. And so it just the post 9/11 era in general it's just like it's put that stuff into hyperdrive. But of course it goes much further back than that. And there's a reason why these types of racist killings happen in the United States, why they're happening in Canada, Quebec, I mentioned, why they happened in New Zealand, why they've happened in Australia. And that's because these are all settler colonial nations, right? I mean, and we have to understand that so much of the ideology and culture in the United States, as well as Canada, as well as Australia, as well as New Zealand, is a culture that was born out of white settlers coming and not just taking someone's land over, like, we're here now, this is our land, but a war, an expansion, a constant killing and seizing of territory over a period of hundreds of years. And so the ideology of white nationalism is rooted in a settler colonial history. And the kind of like the carrying out of these killings with guns, right? Those mass shootings of Muslims, mass shootings of non-white people. I mean, this is in our very history. The first gun laws in the United States, before it was, when there were colonies, the first gun laws were that every single white settler had to have a gun at all times. Those were the gun laws because that's how contested it was. It was a constant war to kill Native American people and seize their land. And so, of course, all culture today has grown out of that. The same is true in New Zealand. And so that's why we see these similar phenomena. It's not just that Trump inspired this guy in New Zealand because he like wants to be American and appreciates what he's saying about America, is that these countries have the same very, very similar histories. Yeah.
And I mean, again, you're absolutely correct in saying that in the post 9/11 era, all of this went into hyperdrive. But I mean, going back to, the Clinton administration, I mean, when that administration imposed sanctions on Iraq and 500,000 Iraqi children died because of this. And also there were bombing campaigns carried out later. But I mean, there's the famous interview with Madeleine Albright where where she where she says that the price is worth it, of 500,000 children dying because of U.S. sanctions on Iraq. So again, this isn't particular to either the Republicans or the Democrats, but it's a concerted political project that's an integral feature of the United States foreign policy apparatus. And one more word on Islamophobia and misconceptions of Islam. It's something I've pondered a lot because of my studies, but also because of the different authors I read. And it's interesting to note. I mean, look at someone like Christopher Hitchens, and I think this should be a warning for those who are on the left too, because this was a guy who, for the majority of his life, identified as a Marxist, as a leftist, as a socialist of some sort, and yet, once 9/11 happens, I mean, and even a little bit before then, but really 9/11 kind of, for lack of a better term, broke his brain, and he just completely doubled down on Islamophobic rhetoric, on anti-Muslim hate. And it's astonishing. I mean, this is a guy who co-authored a collection of essays. He co-edited a collection of essays with Edward Said that talked about the Israeli occupation of Palestine. And so it makes you wonder how deep a lot of this Islamophobia runs in American society and British society and French society. And it shows you, even if you think you have the best ideas, if you're with it, you might find yourself repeating some of these hateful claims without even knowing it, because it's such a systemic feature. It's similar to the fact that, face it. I mean, obviously leftist spaces are better than most, but how many stories have we heard of, racism or sexism creeping into socialist spaces, unfortunately? Yeah. And that's a process we have to be, vigilant about and rooting these regressive ideas out. And Islamophobia should be just as up there on the priority list, because, I mean, in the figure of Hitchens, but in others, you could see just how much that it could, take a foothold into the consciousness of someone who thinks that they're fighting on, behalf of justice. And the next thing you know, you're essentially calling for a neoconservative foreign policy.
Yeah, it reminds me of, in tank units, they name their tank, and they they stencil on the name on the main gun of the tank. I mean, I remember seeing anti-Muslim names on these tanks that were headed for Iraq and everything. And so, if you're in the military, you're seeing this stuff. It's raw. You're totally right to be repulsed by it, and it's not just a jokey, trolly thing. It's ideology. It's being used to kill people in other countries, but it's also the ideology that's being used that justifies these types of killings, this horrific mosque shooting. And it's a growing threat, because I saw that recently they determined that at that that infamous torch march that happened recently, where they were chanting "Jews will not replace us" in right. Defense of a Confederate statue. A report just came out that they determined that 7 of the people at that neo-Nazi march were active duty military. 7 of them. That shows that there's something happening, and it's a little different than how that happened in the past. I mean, I remember in the early 2000s, after the Iraq War had started, there were white supremacist organizations, neo-Nazi organizations, that were having people join the military to get military training. Then they would come out and they would teach their, neo-Nazi gang in the swamps of Florida, how to do react to contact, things like that. But this is different. Those were more fringe white supremacist groups that were exploiting the military for training. But now this is different. These soldiers who are going to the Charlottesville and stuff, they're being swept into a larger mass movement, a larger white supremacist nationalist movement. It's not the same as some little terrorist group sending people in to get training. I mean, they're part of they're joining something that's much larger and much more widespread.
Yeah, I think the 7 U.S. Military members that were identified recently, they're part of Identity Europa, which is one of these main contemporary white nationalist, white supremacist groups. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was it's interesting because it was a spread. It wasn't just there's one unit that happened to have a group of guys that coalesced around this ideology. What it was you have 2 Marines, 2, Army ROTC cadets, a member of the Texas National Guard, a member of the Air Force, and an Army physician who, by the way, is an 04, is a major, is a field grade officer. So again, across the ranks, you can see that this ideology of hate, of white supremacy, is gaining currency, because the actual material function of the United States military is to inflict violence on those who oppose U.S. imperialist hegemony.
Absolutely. And I just want to say to any of our listeners who are Muslim or have family members who are Muslim, we are with you. I mean, it was just so horrific to see this killing happen. The most important thing we can do as veterans, as active duty people, is stand against bigotry, stand against racism. I mean, because that's the tool that's used to justify all types of horrible violence by the military, and also by these kind of characters that, are kind of carrying out the ideology that's fed into them by the war machine and so forth. So. Yeah. You have our solidarity as much as we can give.
Absolutely. So just to give this a wider historical context, in 2015, the Hampton Institution, which is a working class think tank, shout out to Colin Jenkins and all the great people involved there, and we'll attach this document to this episode, but they released in 2015, April 2015, a study titled Rising Nazism and Racial Intolerance in the United States, a Contemporary Analysis. And it was a report for the United Nations General Assembly. And, it goes through, it runs the gamut of rising Nazism and white supremacy in the U.S., but there is a particular section on the U.S. military that is quite insightful, and it's one that stuck with me, and, I remember reading it at the time, and I've always referred back to it. And, of course, it speaks to the fact that there has been a long and tense relationship with the U.S. military with regards to neo-Nazi movements and white supremacist organizations and this idea of joining the military to gain combat training to then bring it out on the outside. It gives a great historical primer in that the founder of the first American Nazi Party, George Lincoln Rockwell, was a World War II veteran from the Navy. His successor, Matthias Kuhl Jr., who created the New Order Nazi Party in the U.S., was a veteran of the Marine Corps. It kind of takes you on this analysis. It goes to, the 80s, the 90s. But I guess one of the most striking features is, in 2008, a report released by the FBI based on information gathered from 2001 to 2008 straight up acknowledges that military experience is found throughout the white supremacist extremist movement as the result of recruitment campaigns by extremist groups and self-recruitment by veterans sympathetic to white supremacist causes. It goes on to say that individuals with military backgrounds frequently occupy leadership roles within extremist groups, and their involvement has the potential to reinvigorate an extremist movement suffering from loss of leadership and infighting during the post-9/11 period. Now, put that into the context of this most recent revelation of these 7 military personnel having direct ties to this Identity Europa group. You start to see that a lot of what the military professes to be about in terms of its inclusion, its diversity, is a farce. And really, at its core, the U.S. military can only serve the interests of reactionary politics, can only serve the interests of white supremacy and violence. Because as you explained earlier, Mike, that countries such as the United States, such as the UK, such as France, they are colonialist enterprises that always will seek to displace those who are different from them, and usually indigenous people, usually people of color, black or brown, and that we shouldn't be surprised when these revelations come to light anymore. I mean, a brief anecdote, again, my time in the Rangers, I was surrounded by many different varieties of racism, in particular Islamophobic racism when I was in Afghanistan and how people relished the idea of killing. When I was at West Point, the institution itself deified Robert E. Lee and other slaveholders. When I was a freshman there, as part of my Middle Eastern history class, Israeli ambassador Michael Oren, who's, a hyper-conservative Israeli politician, Zionist nationalist, he came in and spoke to us. This guy completely denigrating the Palestinian cause. I mean, these things are a systemic feature. They're not a bug. And if we're really to grapple with what the U.S. military means, we need to do everything in our power to fight back against white supremacy, against white nationalism, while recognizing that this country that we're a part of has at its core that ideology. And it's up to us to defeat these vile forces and find a way to bring about an actually authentic, inclusive community of people. I guess there's a few more details from the study that I think are worth noting. Towards the end, it includes a couple pictures. One of them, which I think some of the listeners probably are familiar with, I think we might have mentioned it before, but there's a Marine sniper unit that's posing with a U.S. flag, and then underneath it is a Nazi SS bolt flag, the SIG runes, which of course was the logo, the insignia of the Waffen-SS. And when they were confronted about it, they said, oh, well, the SS stood for Scout Sniper, something stupid. Like, they know very well what they were doing. And then also, another interesting one is Marines of the 3rd Battalion, 6th Regiment, 2nd Marine Division are seen posing with a Confederate flag in southern Afghanistan. So, again, these things have been kind of bubbling beneath the surface. And with the 2016 election cycle, it seemed to, bring them to the fore more than in previous years. And I guess, I'd like to read this final paragraph, or at least a short selection from it from the study that says, there's both a historical and ideological correlation between Nazi and neo-Nazi movements and state militaries. In the United States, there's a documented trend of neo-Nazi and white supremacist groups encouraging their members to seek state-sponsored military training for use in carrying out or participating in domestic terrorism or the prophesized racial holy war, as well as a concerted effort on the part of white supremacists and Nazi leaders to actively recruit within the ranks of the military, including specifically targeting veterans. This trend has intensified since the beginning of the U.S. so-called War on Terror, which has created a significantly large pool of embattled soldiers and veterans returning to a bleak economic landscape caused by a prolonged economic downturn, and so on, and it goes on. But all of this, white supremacist ideology, as we mentioned earlier, is fueled by a conspiratorial understanding of reality and history. If you want to read deeper on this in a theoretical sense, Franz Neumann, who was a thinker associated with the Frankfurt School, he has this notion called the conspiracy theory of history, which is characterized by a false concreteness. And what it is, in the simplest of terms, is this idea that there's always a group seeking to carry out its nefarious actions behind closed doors. There's always a group seeking to overturn what should be a so-called natural order. But really, all of this, it is complete nonsense, but it still has some staying power with a number of groups. And so I bring this up because when it comes to analyzing the function of the U.S. military, when it comes to analyzing capitalism, U.S. foreign policy, U.S. economic policy, it's not a conspiracy. It's clear as day what's happening. Okay, it's a systemic function. Even if you got rid of Trump, the machine would keep on turning. As much as I hope Bernie Sanders gets elected, and I think it would do great things, relatively speaking, the actual institution itself, though, would remain. See, it's not about any one or two figures. It's about a systemic structural analysis. Now, of course, people are culpable. Certain figures are more responsible than others. But if we're, going to actually be able to fight back against a lot of these, insane notions that the alt-right is peddling, we must not ourselves on the left delve into any sort of conspiratorial argument, which, again, much like I invoked with Christopher Hitchens falling into the Islamophobic trap, I think we need to resist the conspiracy trap. Conspiracy is fundamentally a reactionary understanding, and it's usually, it's usually peddled because it makes it easier to grapple with, the insanity of our existing reality. So if you want to read further on this particular analysis, we've attached the Hampton Institution study to this episode, but also Anxiety and Politics by Franz Neumann details quite well how this fascist reactionary mindset manifests itself.
Thank you for that, Spencer. And we wanted to end this episode in a way that honored the victims of the New Zealand massacre, with at least 50 dead and many more fighting for their lives in critical condition. We thought it would be fitting to do so by playing the Muslim call to prayer, or azan, and the call to prayer done by a child, since children as young as 4 years old were among the victims of the shooting, not to mention the many orphans it left behind. So in these last couple of minutes, we asked you to think of the victims and how you in your own life can contribute to ending anti-Muslim bigotry and violence in all forms. We leave you with this and the words of New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinta Ardern, which she spoke at the first mass memorial for the victims. Quote, "When any part of the body suffers, the whole body feels pain. We mourn with you. We are one."
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
You've been listening to Eyes Left with Spencer Rapone.
And Mike Preisner. All of our content is free for everyone, but we can't do it without your help. So if you support this project, go to patreon.com/eyesleft to make it possible to continue. Be sure to follow us on social media at EyesLeftPod.
And if you're in the military, a military family member, or veteran and want to share your story, report problems in mismanagement, or need advice or assistance knowing your rights, including your right to get the hell out or refuse deployment, please write us at eyesleftpod@gmail.com.
Eyes left.